Well, everybody, thank you for joining us today at lunch. I'd like to welcome you to the first of our new webinar series on supply chain. This started last year as part of our supply chain initiative throughout the state of West Virginia and our national MEP network. We did a four-part series last year with Adam Lowe from Orchard Street Solutions, and everybody seemed to really like it. So we thought we'd do another follow-on one that kind of takes it to the next step and more manufacturing focused. If you didn't attend the first one last year, that's available online, and you didn't need to see that for this one. But it is out there if you want to take a look at it and learn some supply chain basics. My name is David Carrick. I'm the Associate Director for the WVU Industrial Extension and in charge of our supply chain efforts. We've been working on a 2-year program with our partners in NIST MEP around the country to study supply chain. The pandemic taught us a lot as we kind of come on that time of year again, and we've learned a lot from that. And what we're trying to do is find ways to make our supply chain more resilient, whether that be helping people find a secondary supplier, maybe a cheaper supply source, or onshore something that you're currently buying overseas. The MEP National Network does that through their supplier scouting program. So if there's something that you're looking to find that you're having trouble finding or you have a sole source for, please let me know. I have a program I'm part of that we can put that out to my colleagues in all 51 MEP centers to maybe try to find a supplier locally for you. So Tracy will include all that information in the follow-up for this webinar. With enough of my chatting, today we have Adam Lowe from Orchard Street Solutions with us. Adam is our resident supply chain expert and all things related to supply chain. I had his bio here, and I apologize. I misplaced it closing things down so I could make this webinar work. But Adam works for Northrop Grumman in supply chain, has been in this area most of his career, had some time in the military doing similar things, and has been a valuable source of information for us in so far as just teaching us about supply chain, directing us on how we can help integrate it into our everyday offerings, and also how to help you all grow your supply chain and make it more resilient. So with that, I'll turn it over to Adam and he can start his presentation.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dave. Greatly appreciate it. Greatly appreciate the WVUIE group inviting me back for another year of supply chain discussion. So thank you all for what you're doing for the state of West Virginia, for the manufacturers within West Virginia. And so let me share my screen a little bit. And Dave mentioned that I am from the state and I grew up in the southern part of the state. So that is definitely one of the main reasons why I am excited to come back in and take what I've learned in some positions within the state and some outside of the state so that we can work together to grow the understanding of supply chain and what that can do for your businesses, as well as the manufacturing operation itself and how you could dovetail those together. So that's a large part of what we're going to be talking about today. I'm going to go ahead and get a thumbs up. Can we see the slides, Dave?
Yes.
Perfect. All right. Well, technology is helping us today. It's not always the case, but it looks like it's helping us today. So let's go ahead and move on from this side. If I can get it to move. Where are we at here? There we go. All right. So yes, that was a great introduction, and thank you again, Dave, for that. And so a little bit of my background. I'll give that here in a second, kind of explain why you want to listen to this guy. If this is your first year on the supply chain series that we're doing, I'll kind of explain a little bit about what I've done in the supply chain world and in other parts of the world, specifically in manufacturing. So I started out in manufacturing. That's one of the reasons why this was an exciting opportunity this year, because it really gets to dovetail what I've done already within manufacturing. So it's been great as I moved into manufacturing and then into supply chain role, and then helped connect those two worlds in a very large company. It's given me some amazing insight, and I'd love to give you all that again, because I come from the state and I want to help you. So today we're going to talk a little bit about that. I'll talk a little bit about supply chain overview. Won't go into detail there. I'm not going to go into detail about defining the operations. I'm sure those of you who are attached to manufacturing, you know what operations are. I'm really going to spend most of the time on the fourth part down here at the bottom, which is strategically leveraging supply chain and operations. And this is going to be kind of a first shot out of the gate, so that we can give some really good information on the first iteration of the series, to connect supply chain in with your operations and give you some areas to look at. I know people get really busy. You might not be able to make it to all of the sessions. So if you don't, at least you'll be able to walk away today with some really good places to look for, how you can connect your supply chain operation with your internal operations group, manufacturing, business operations, and things like that. I also know that everybody often, or many people often, wear multiple hats. So when I'm discussing that throughout the series, just know that it might be talking to you whether you're in one role and you wear 10 different hats, or if you're strategically or specifically positioned in one group. Um, so enough of that intro. This is me. I started out, weirdly enough, in journalism. So you say, how do you go from journalism to operations and manufacturing and supply chain? Well, it's been a crazy journey. Through the Marine Corps, as Dave mentioned, I went into the military, and learned a ton about systems management, leadership, structure, which is a big part of our supply chain focus. Whenever I'm speaking about supply chain, a lot of it is very much structured, very, very systematic, operations oriented, and definition oriented, operating procedures. I'm a big proponent of those, things like that. So a lot of that came from the Marine Corps. I was already kind of a systematic mind anyway. So that really gave word within the Marine Corps, a lot of words actually, and I could say a few of them, but I won't for some of the situations. But it gave a lot of words to what structure is, how it should be employed, and then it was an easy transition out into an operations world in manufacturing, and then into global supply chain, because it just made sense. And so as I've built more and more training like this one that we're going through, I've learned really focusing in on that structure, that strategy, that layers of planning, procedure, definition is extremely important. That has given me the ability to see where these connecting points are, often because there's a deficit, right? The communications deficit in an area. It opens up an opportunity to create a connecting point. Again, that's what we're going to talk about mainly today in the later slides. So again, I am from the state of West Virginia. I love the state. One of my big missions in starting Orchard Street Solutions was so that I could go back into the state, the businesses, the manufacturing companies, anybody there who will listen, and I can help grow the economy, the people, the families, the jobs in the state of West Virginia. So it's a big part of my focus, and I love doing this. This is why I was so happy to be able to work with the WVUIE group and have them bring me again for a second year. All right, so a supply chain overview. Again, not going to go into super depth, but I'm going to start from where we ended last year in the Supply Chain 101 series. We talked about a wide view of supply chain last year. It was very much all of the links, looking at it from a 10,000-foot view. What does a supply chain look like, and how do these links work together? One of those links would be your company, right? So your company is going to be a link in someone's supply chain. You are going to have internal supply chain operations, and you're going to have external supply chain operations. Those external, they're reaching into your vendors who are supplying you with items. And then how do all of those chains work together to go from raw material to final sell out the door? We talked a lot about that, talked about strategy, about the future state, but it was really a high level view. This year, we're going a little bit closer into the link. We're going to talk about your link on the supply chain, internally, your operations, your manufacturing operations, as well as your business, quality, all of those good things that you do inside of your company to make your product, to add value so that you can sell it out the back end. But we also don't want to forget that within your internal operation, there needs to be a connection outside to your outside vendors. So we're going to talk a little bit about those connecting points. We're going to talk about some connecting points internally, with your operations, your manufacturing operations, things that you can do to help each other out. And then how do you create a more cohesive group to create that streamlined supply chain operation, as well as the manufacturing? It's just going to be overall operation. So you'll see in a slide here coming up that I nestle supply chain within your operations group. Some companies do, some companies don't. There's good arguments on both sides, but in my mind, the supply chain operation isn't segregated in its own stovepipe. It is a part of your internal operation as well. And then again, supply chain touches everything. So kind of wrap that one up, that last bullet up there. Okay, so the supply chain overview. I'm going to run through this one relatively quickly. Be happy to answer questions. I'm going to try to leave some time at the end for some questions. So if you do have them, I'll try to pause in the middle, in between the two, before we start going into those connector points for any kind of initial questions. If not, feel free to keep them towards the end or afterwards, sending them today. But I'm sure they can get me questions if you have any. Um, Totally fine if you don't either. I'm not going to give anybody homework today. I don't think. We'll see. So the
And
supply chain
also,
overview, the framework,
Adam, and
these
also feel free
are
to leave
kind
your
of
questions.
areas that your supply chain can touch. Um, Sorry, Dave, were you saying something?
I would say also feel free to leave questions in the chat if you have questions.
Awesome. Yeah, there we go. Sorry, I have my little headphones here. I gotta listen because I don't want it to kind of reverb back in for everybody. So yeah, please do put the questions in the chat as well, and we'll get to them. We'll get to them in the midpoint and then at the tail end as well. So, for the supply chain overview, the framework, this is really just where your supply chain may touch your operation. And it's kind of how to look at a supply chain in totality from beginning of the stream of production all the way through the end. Not every group is going to have these specific parts, and I did throw some bullet points in there as just examples, but these in no way, shape, or form is an exhaustive list. This is just to get the juices flowing, to see where your supply chain might come into your organization or be attached to your organization. So we'll start with design. That's at the very front end, and one of the bullets that I put is subcomponent development. So that's just one area when you're developing, whether or not you're going to go external or internal, as you're building some piece of whatever your final product will be, your supply chain group is going to touch that, right? That you're going to need to know what is out in the world that you could possibly do, or your supply chain person. I say group a lot, and I apologize because you might be the supply chain group person, you might be, manufacturing connection, you might have warehousing connection, you might be sales, you might be a business operations. It could be you, again, wearing many hats. So if I say group, I don't mean to be I don't mean to offend anyone. Although you could say I am a group unto myself. The next level is kind of planning. In the planning stages, as far as planning your operation, planning what you're going to do, how you're going to do it, vendor selection, terms and conditions, administration, those type of things are where a supply chain role or a supply chain hat will definitely dovetail into your operation. But those are kind of some more supply chain centric areas that people have within their operations, or they call it kind of, this is our supply chain group, and this is what we do. In sales, they can be attached from order generation, like how do you generate your orders. There's a lot of connections. I'm not going to go in depth there because I do a little bit more later on that one. Transportation and logistics. This one's very much supply chain, moving your parts into your company, moving them around within your company, and then moving them out. A lot of the times that's the supply chain department and the supply chain role. Manufacturing, product creation, all the way through building. There can be elements that touch. I'll explain more on that later. And I'm sure many of you already have the juices flowing and are starting to think of how your supply chain does touch your manufacturing. And then a final delivery, of course, getting it out the back end and then talking to your customer. That can be a business operation, but it can also be just a supply chain hat that you wear from beginning to end. Next, we'll talk about operations. This one will probably, for those of us who have been in the manufacturing roles, this might feel a little bit more familiar. If you've never been in a supply chain centric type of a role, it'll start to become very familiar when you start to hear some of the language. So, and for mainly, I want to highlight the areas. And again, not an exhaustive list. I'm sure all will be able to point to many different areas within your operation that supply chain touches. But again, juices flowing, just trying to get us on the same page. These are some of the highlights that I've had. So the front end, we're talking about planning and design and ideation. Supply chain can touch that. We'll talk about some of those touch points. Sales and marketing. It's a very important to think through your supply chain when you're developing a marketing campaign based on what your company wants to portray into the world. Supply chain might have a part of that, and I'll go over an explanation there as well. Logistical functions internally, manufacturing, hit that one really heavy for the next couple of weeks. Quality, supply chain. There we go again. That's your operations. Again, I'm just using supply chain within an operations framework just to keep sinking in that supply chain isn't external. It's not a stovepiped operation. It's very much attached to what you do internally as well as externally. That's kind of your reach out of your company sometimes, as well as your business operations or sales, which again could be the same hat. business development and planning, and then management functions of all kinds. So that's in every department that you might have, every group. If you have managers or management functions, supply chain is important there as well. And that can even just go to the day-to-day consumable operation that you have. Um, you know, everything from any supply that you have to make your business go. I think a lot of the times we think of subcomponents only, whatever goes into the final product, but your supply chain can be very helpful in keeping your costs down. So if you're, looking at ways to reduce cost, there are ways within your consumable group, in terms of nitrile gloves or Q-tips, those type of things that can also be very useful for your supply chain person to be aware of budgeting concerns or constraints, or how are we building our a reduction of overall cost. Well, if you're we'll keep buying all of the same consumables, maybe you've got an opportunity there to save a few $1,000s, few $100s, whatever, but it all goes to the bottom line. All right, and this is the fun part. So I will pause here really quickly, Dave, and see if anybody does have any questions up to this point, or any need to clarify kind of what we were looking at.
It doesn't look like we have any questions so far. No questions so far.
All right, fantastic. Thank you, Dave. If you do have them, again, throw them in the chat, and we'll go to town. So here's how we can start looking to strategically leverage supply chain within the operation. Um, Again, I said earlier that this won't be an exhaustive list. There's going to be so many more. But what I'm hoping is that we can think through maybe where we're stovepiped, or where we don't necessarily consider the touch point, and start looking for those within your operation, even now. And then when you leave today, even if you aren't able to make it throughout those a little bit more strategic elements, next week we have implementing strategic supply chain, the logistical functions of implementing it. And that's going to be much more heavily focused on the actual day to day and what you can look for and how to do it. Then we have cultivating a professional supplier relationships. That's number 3. And then the final one is maintaining supply chain focused systems into the future. So if you can come back, I would definitely recommend that. But for today, what we want to do is just give you some jumping off points so that you can run back into your organization and start at least thinking and looking at some of these connecting points. So we'll start with the front end development. I mentioned a few things earlier, but I'm going to go into a little bit more detail here for the planning, design, and ideation. So when you're talking about logistical planning and design, one of the things that I've seen can be a little bit difficult, let's say, within the working relationship between the design folks and the supply chain folks, is design sometimes can want to, and I don't mean this in a negative way, over engineer. And so they start creating a design for something that is going to be very hard to source suppliers for. So having a voice at the table, if the supply chain person who really understands what vendors you have in your pipeline, or the legwork it's going to take to develop a vendor relationship, might be able to set in on a discussion early on and say, why don't we either connect you as a designer to some of our external suppliers, so that as you're designing, you can start to talk tolerances, or you can start to talk like, what is the difficulty of building this? What is the cost structure? What is the pricing? If we're going to go this far, you very often can find situations where you make your tolerances a little bit wider. The product doesn't suffer. It's just it's a good to have, or we would like to be able to make it a little sleeker, a little smaller, a little bigger, whatever. If you start discussing that early on with your supply chain person, they might be able to link you in with the right vendor, or at least the right mentality to say, hey, let's widen this parameter a little bit, and then we can add in another 20 suppliers potentially, if you can work with us on your tolerances. So that's kind of a discussion that you might have with, as far as the logistical planning or the design phase, gives you more options. And that's the second bullet point there. Flexibility and options are huge for your supply chain person, in terms of when you can do it. So, oftentimes we think, yeah, well, it's at the lowest price. That's what we're looking for. Sometimes we're looking for timeline. Sometimes we're looking for, turnaround times. And what is the the production time at your vendor in order to be able to get that? Or what is the lot sizes that you have to order for, X, Y, and Z in order to bring that product in? Well, if we have those discussions early on, we can start getting that planning done on the supply chain side in tandem with your design side. Now, this can be frustrating, I will say, because sometimes designs change, as we all know. But at least when you start to get those balls moving and those ideas flowing, you can start to source those things. So that reduces your overall timeline. When you're already have your supply chain person out into the world looking for those vendors who either may be able to make what that subcomponent that you're looking at, or maybe they say, listen, it's going to be so hard for you to find a vendor who can make it up to your spec. We may want to think about internally sourcing that. What would it cost? Management team. I mentioned that on the last slide, bringing your management in with your supply chain person. Hey, I know that there's one vendor in the world that can do this and they've got a 12-month lead time on their material. Maybe we want to think about buying a machine that costs $50,000 that can build that subcomponent on our own. And then we can leverage that for other areas of the factory. Those type of decisions can be made when you bring your supply chain focused person. If you kind of break down that stovepipe structure into the discussion earlier on, you can start to think through whether or not those decisions on the very front side, so that you don't have to get midstream and say, sorry, this vendor is just not going to be able to make that timeline. We should have just bought the machine at the front side. Now you have to buy it. You're 12 months behind, whatever. Again, will it always be the case? And do you have to do this for every product? No, certainly not. I mean, some of the things, your cups, your forks, and your plates that you're putting in the break room, they don't need that level of discussion, right? You can go anywhere and get those. The supplier won't need to be brought in at that level, but you do have to think through, in terms of planning, those logistical elements of what you're trying to accomplish. And then also too, a note that I'll make here is, in terms of logistics, is the supply that you're and the opportunities that you have are only are only so wide in the world. So when we're talking about like buying the fork, spoons, and knives, like you can go anywhere for that. Those aren't your primary pieces. If you can focus in terms of planning on your at least identifying them on early stages, if you can focus in on what are those elements within our build structure that could potentially cause us to shut down your single threaded items, that's helpful. And we'll talk a little bit more about this later in the manufacturing operations part. But that's really extremely helpful for your supply chain person to know, because that limits their scope a little bit. We don't need to focus on this 80% of the material because we can get that from any shop along the route. But this 20% is really important. So being able to highlight that, document it, put it somewhere in a work instruction that can be seen, by your supply chain group, or at least having those discussions with your supply chain group in terms of ideation and development of your product, that's going to help them to know, okay, I can focus in a little bit more on these pieces to try to either make an extremely solid relationship with that vendor who can make that part for us, or or look for other vendors who might be able to make that, so that we're not single threaded. It's just a note on the front side there, some areas that you can look at when in terms of supply chain meeting up with that early stage. And that's something you can revamp and review as you go along as well. So as you're building and things are changing and designs are changing, always thinking through, are we single threaded on any of our key components? Those type of questions are always good to have. Those, in my experience, are the things that cause the biggest hiccups within a manufacturing operation, is those times when you have a key component, there's one vendor or one supplier, and and they have an accident at their facility, and a machine, burns down or breaks down, and they can't make that. That creates major havoc downstream. It's hard for those supply chain folks, if they don't have that information up front and they haven't at least been thinking through, what would we do if that company couldn't supply that. Then they've got to start from scratch when the bad news comes, right? So giving them the ability to know what those key components are, extremely important, either from the ideation or the design phase, or on the manufacturing floor. Again, we'll talk about that here in just a second. Next is sales and marketing. I mentioned this a little bit earlier. So that's a cohesive messaging and creating margin. That's both financial margin and time margin. And so the cohesive messaging, an example I like to use is if you are marketing yourself into the world as a USA based supply, that's all you do. You are only USA. That's every component that's in there. You don't want to have a rogue supply chain agent that's out there that's sourcing material from wherever in the world that they want. That messaging and that marketing messaging and that branding messaging is really important, at least to be known by your supply chain folks. That's setting a really good goal mission statement up front that is marketed throughout your company as much as it is outside of your company. And then having a supply chain person, as well as the other operations groups, everybody within your operations group, understanding kind of what those key components of your branding and your messaging are. It's just a good idea to have that. Won't go too much more into detail there, but I'm sure you can understand. Creating margin, that's time margin and financial margin. So understanding for sales specifically, what subcomponents within your supply are driving the cost of those. Perhaps they're a very expensive piece that's part of your supply that you're ordering from company Z, and you would love to be able to sell more, right? Your sales team, they're in the field, they say, man, I could have sold another 25 of these. The cost is just too high because of this one component internally. It costs $100,000, whatever it is. It skyrockets the price of the overall final piece, the final component. Well, that might give a target for your supply chain person to say, man, if we could just reduce that cost by 10%, we might have been able to make more sales in the back end. So what kind of supplier relationship do I have? What kind of backup options do we have? Is this a single threaded supplier? Are they the only one in the world that can make this, or are there other options, and what are those prices? And of course, there are methodologies behind that. You don't want to just go directly out into the world, and maybe in all situations, some situations you might, but start sourcing those other options. You have to consider the terms and conditions and contracting and all that kind of stuff, but at least gives them the opportunity to say, hey, I can help sales if I can source or have a relationship with that vendor to reduce the cost by 5%, 10%. Maybe we sell an additional 2, 3, 5 units. That all hits the bottom line downstream. So that's how you can think through, oh, I'm not really just wearing a supply chain hat. I'm kind of looking at our sales department too and saying, hey, what do you all need? What could you use from me? Those type of conversations and touch points are extremely important in a lot of different areas. And you'll see that throughout this whole presentation. The next one are logistical functions. This is kind of bread and butter for a lot of we supply chain folks. Shipping and delivery, material storage and tracking. One thing I always like to look at in this particular section in terms of supply chain and how we can help each other, or if we're the same group in the logistical function, what can we do internally? What are our practices internally within our shipping and our delivery that can help us either with maybe it's material location. I mean, how many times have we needed that one piece of material that didn't get put in the right place, right? It's hidden, it's lost, it's whatever, and then that causes a timeline issue. So what are we doing within that function to create? And again, I'm a very digital person, digital footprint and openness to information. So you'll hear a lot of that kind of theme throughout this presentation and many of the future ones. But what material storage, what tracking do we have that can give a supply chain person an understanding of how the material actually comes into our facility? How do we document it? How do we store it? How do we look at what the usage? Are we seeing any lost material? Are we seeing scrap material because maybe we have a supply chain, like a vendor supply chain person up front that checks it when it comes in the building? And we say, yeah, well, certain vendors of ours, about 5 out of every 100 pieces are not usable. Is that being documented? Is that being tracked? Or are we just kind of saying, well, it's only $10 a piece. It's not that big of a deal. But, you get 100, you know, deliveries per year, that adds up. Right? That's one little thing that you can do. If you're documenting that kind of information, what a supply chain person can do is jump back into that document. They can start looking for correlation, and maybe you on the shipping delivery side, maybe you don't really think through what you're getting. You're just looking at it and you're bringing it through and you're putting it away. But what they might be able to do on their side is saying, well, I know that this company provides 20 different products for us, and all of them come in with quality issues. it might be that you see 10 here, 10 there, and you don't really make the connection that it's the same company that's sending in material that has quality issues. You might just be putting it away and going on. But if you have those quality issues that you screen for right up front, a supply chain person with the right information, the right analysis, might be able to kind of find those correlations, those causation. This is adding, $2,500, $5,000 a year because we just have to kind of scrap this material, and it's the same company that's doing it. Obviously gives them options, right, to go out and start sourcing, or having that conversation with the relationship that they built with that vendor potentially. Material storage and tracking, same thing. I won't go into too much detail on that one. There'll be more to come on that in future iterations. It's got a lot to say about that one, as well as manufacturing. And there's manufacturing. All right. So manufacturing this is when I have it's near and dear to my heart, because my very first foray into global supply chain was coming from a manufacturing position. I was a manufacturing general manager in multiple locations. And then my first step into global supply chain was to develop a an on the floor global supply chain presence within our manufacturing area. It hadn't been done before. We hadn't had somebody on the floor, looking at the floor, understanding the floor, knowing what they need, knowing their operations, and then being able to translate that out in the terms of global supply chain and supply chain practices. So I had to learn a lot about that side, the supply chain, what it is that how do they talk? What do they look at? What are their quotas? What does their metrics look like? I had to learn all that piece and then try to find those connector points for the manufacturing floor. And they're all over the place. You'd be shocked at how many times things and practices on the manufacturing floor will impact your supply chain and vice versa. So, again, lots to come on this one next week, but I will just give a quick example for your production planning and scheduling. This is one that I worked with in a very detailed manner, trying to figure out how do we set up, especially if you're a just-in-time manufacturing company, and that's your philosophy on manufacturing. I know that just-in-time sometimes it makes people give the two thumbs up, and sometimes it's two thumbs down. So wherever you fall on the spectrum, I understand that is a likelihood that people are at least looking for ways to make their material deliveries quicker, so that we can get them built up quicker and we can get more material out the back end. So whether or not you are fully just in time, or you're trying not to carry too much cost, you're not buying every piece of material up front, as many as you can possibly get, and then you have a ton of money wrapped up in your storage area. All of us to some degree want to keep an eye on that wherever you fall on that spectrum. So one of the things that we've seen, especially in companies who have very long lead times, and this might lean a little bit more into your scheduling and how it can impact you, um, is understanding what contracts did you put in with your sub vendor up front as far as their delivery timelines, and then how does that actually impact your production schedule. So anytime something happens at the very tail end of your production schedule, as you all know who are in manufacturing, things happen, right? You quote the in-house production time for a certain part of your build project is going to be 6 weeks, turns into 12 weeks, 15 weeks, 80 weeks, whatever. And sometimes, especially if it's a new build, it's something you're just starting, you're kind of ballparking it. But when you have to have some material that's going to support that well in advance, especially let's say lead times on just getting you the material into the front door is 6 months, and you have an 8 to 10 week lead time, and that's further down on the build structure. Any change that happens down there means you have to have that material earlier to start the earlier build part of the build. So anytime you have a contract that is set up with a company to deliver on January 1, but you actually end up needing it November 1 or December 1, a month in advance, 2 months in advance, in order to meet that build schedule, the more information you can have and give to your supply chain person, and the more they can give to you, the better off you're going to be. Again, I want to go so in depth in this one because I love it, but I won't go any more in depth. But needless to say, a lot more to come on this one. But how your manufacturing operation can communicate that information off of the floor through and into your supply chain group or person, um, is extremely important. And then knowing what they might need to hear is extremely important as well. Again, we'll talk a lot more about that one, but there are so many things that a supply chain person can do if they have the right information, and help you on the manufacturing floor to keep your people busy, to keep the material in hand, to not for the business minded folks and your financial minded folks, so that they're not ordering 20 times what they need, and keeping it on the shelf with, that money's just tied up there. If those communication channels and how you set them up in terms of what exactly is needed to know on both sides, extremely important. Again, won't go into more detail there, but I will later. So for your quality, your vendor material review and your PO planning and scrap. So I mentioned material review earlier. That can be done on the front side. It can be done on the floor. Sometimes that's another part of your manufacturing operation. Potentially is that you have a quality check. If you start to see that there's a common piece that fails quality, it's not working the way it should work, and you got to scrap it, you got to throw it away. Um, that can impact your overall operation. The next time you reach onto your shelf to get one, it might not be there because you scrapped it out, right? You don't have enough to finish your build. What does that do? It means, oh, we got to get supply chain on the phone really quickly, see if they can get some of these in for us, right? So if you can, again, digitization is very, very important. I know sometimes for some operations, especially smaller operations who might not have done it as much, it can be kind of a, ERP systems, MRP systems. I'm a proponent of them, but I'm also a proponent of making what works for you. It doesn't have to be the big SAP, every bell and whistle, but having some sort of digitized system of control gives you the opportunity in this situation to look back at those potential pieces that are scrapped. So you have a vendor who maybe they regularly have 10% of their material scrapped. You're ordering, 100 pieces from them, 10 of them get scrapped every time. That single easy piece of information that you might have out on the floor and you might be able to track out on the floor, if you communicate that back to your supply chain person, they can just add that scrap rate onto the original PO and just buy 10 extra every time they buy 100. We burn 10, we're going to get 10 more. Now, of course, it comes down to terms and conditions and contracts and who pays for that. That's a supply chain function. We could talk about that downstream. It's not really the intent of this call, but those type of things are at least ways you can set yourself up for success in the future so that your timeline doesn't get driven out the door because you lost 10 pieces. You're not always going to know that, but the more you know, the better. The more you're able to track those type of things, the better. The more information like that you have, the better information a supply chain person can go out and say, listen, this vendor is always causing us to go into the red. It's time for us to have a backup. It's time for us to go out and at least start looking into the world and seeing if there's another vendor who might not cause us as much timeline headache, things like that. Um, Again, so what have we talked about virtually the whole call? It's the communication strategy. So this gives us the ability to put a defined and a very, doesn't have to be extremely structured, but somewhat of a structured communication strategy in place. Who needs to talk to supply chain and why? What do they need to know? How are they gathering that information? And then how supply chain can use that in order to go out into the world and make the operation run more smoothly. Um, Again, talk a lot more about that in the future state, but that is a piece of what we look at in the supply chain world as being able to give us the right information so that we can help you. Again, this is one link of your chain. It's not two separate links. It's not two separate organizations. And then if you take that a bit further, it's even out into your vendor community. They're a part of your supply chain too. It might not seem like they're a part of your internal supply chain, right? They're not a part of your internal group, but if their operations aren't running smoothly and they're not getting you the material that you need, and the last example, it's being able to kind of reach out and talk to that person to get a PO that's cut for an extra 10 pieces, for instance. Um, if they don't know that they need to do that for you, they're just going to continue to send you the same ones. And your chain, your link there between your external and your internal is your supply chain function. It's your vendor manager. And again, wearing different hats, it might be the same person that does that has that networking ability or that communicative ability with your vendors. But that kind of information is extremely important for them to have. On the flip side, too much information, it gets whitewashed, and then you lose track of what you really need to know. That's why having these regular discussions on what would help if, from a manufacturing perspective, looking at supply chain, saying what would help you if you knew something about how we operate. Scrap rate, that's a good example. What else? Well, timelines, and how do you determine what you're going to build? Do you just come up with whatever product you want to build that day, or do you have a build structure on what you would like to build? What's the most efficient way for you to build on the floor? If you have 20 product lines, how can I align the deliveries to meet those specific products that you want to buy? What sales department, what do we normally sell? What is our heavy hitter? What do we, do we have any kind of trajectory on how our sales go? They peak with a certain product in January. What subcomponents go into that product? Well, if they've got a 6-month lead time, we need to start planning for that spike, that January spike. All of those are communications channels. Having your salesperson sitting there, having your manufacturing group saying, yeah, we know that we're going to have to build up some of those because we sell a ton of them in January. Let's get them in December. Well, let's go 6 months before that because that's the timeline it takes to get the subcomponents for that piece. All right, now we're looking mid-year last year on what we need to have ordered and how we need to have it ordered, the scrap rates, all that included. That way, when that peak happens, you've already planned for it all. And it's just because those communication channels aren't siloed. Again, so much more to go in on that one. This is, if you can tell, this is kind of like the puzzle pieces that I love to put together. But it hopefully this is getting the juices flowing on, oh yeah, I can see how that does touch. Or maybe I hadn't thought of that before. Or maybe you know all this and you're doing perfect. If so, I need to talk to you because I'm growing in this every day. I'm learning something new. So truthfully, I would love to have conversations with folks who are doing it. I love having conversations with those supply chain groups that are actually doing it, living it, doing the digitization, using AI, using the whole thing, if you have the ability to do it, and grow with each other. So again, love to talk to you. All right, let's go to the next page here. All right, last couple ones here. So strategically leveraging supply chain and operations in terms of business development and planning. So budgeting and quoting. Talked a little bit about this earlier, but getting that information on the front side, knowing your options when you're quoting a final product, understanding that maybe your primary supplier vendor is fantastic. They deliver on time every time, and it's at a certain cost that you just love for, a significant number of your subcomponents. Great. People love your product. I want to increase by twofold. Okay. You sign on the dotted line. Fantastic. You've just doubled what you sold last year to that same company. Well, maybe your supply chain person would know we had that sub vendor at capacity. Like it was a great price and they were able to deliver all the time. However, they can't double that. Maybe they don't have the capacity to double that. You might not know that right offhand, but if you get that information, say, hey, I'm going to pitch this customer and a doubling, they're asking for double. Can you look at our supply chain? Like, can you look at the bill of materials on any of the supply chain items that we have coming in, the items that we have coming in from a vendor? Can you see if there's any issues? Goes back to what I was saying at the very beginning. Having those key focus items, they might not have to go to every item on the BOM, but you've highlighted what key components may cause you heartache if either in timeline, price, or availability, right? Like those type of things. If you have them on the phone, and let me call my supply chain person real quick to make sure we can support that. If it's that quick of a lot of these times it's a lot more negotiation than that. But if you're in a situation where you need that information pretty quick, when you've already highlighted those key items, your supply, what they can do, those communication that you've had with that vendor as a supply chain person, what their capacity is, what they could ramp to if you needed it, all of those good things. It's a much quicker process, and you might not lose that extra sell and have them say, never mind, we'll just go back to what we bought last year. Let's just keep doing that. Having that information pretty readily available and then keeping those communication channels open, that could help you with your bottom line sales. And you might be able to say, listen, we can't do double, but we can do 30% more. And then we can ramp rate over the year. Would you be willing to maybe do the other 70% as we source some subcomponents that could help us get you to that doubling of what you're looking for? Those type of options are available if you understand what is driving your supply onto the floor. And if you're doing this every day, and this is just old hat news, just I apologize, but thinking through strategically from soup to nuts in terms of what you have and what you have the availability to do, it gives you more options, gives you the opportunity to potentially sell more, gives you that communication channel to find out whether or not you can sell more or what components could cause you an issue. Those type of discussions that you have with a customer up front, and that arming yourself with that kind of information as a salesperson, or when you're doing quoting or even budgeting for your overall operation, It's extremely important. How you can pull those levers to make things fit just right. And having your supply chain person be a part of those conversations, extremely important. All right. So for managerial functions, again, this one's relatively self-explanatory, but what I'll hone in on here is the human resource element of how supply chain can help your operation. Um, Again, we talked a little bit about it as far as material incoming and being able to know when those deliveries are happening so that you can set your workforce up on the manufacturing floor adequately with the right material that they need to build on the day that you have them scheduled to build. Or even if you need to ramp up, let's go back to the last example, right? You do sell those extra 200 and you think, man, this is great. Supply chain says we can get all this stuff in. This is fantastic. Oh no, we're going to have to go to overtime, right? We're going to have to add some overtime onto this in order to be able to meet these goals and meet these numbers. Again, having that information to say, hey, supply chain, when is that stuff actually going to be here? How sure are we that vendor A is going to be able to deliver that material? Having regular conversations, again, in a lot of our operations, we've got 10,000 pieces of different material that are coming in, 5,000, 100, whatever. It would be really hard to track each individual vendor at that level. Um, so we're talking about key pieces of material, especially. So those key, the wicketing, pieces, those wickets that you have to stick in order to get just the right time, just the right amount of material in order to keep moving. So they can look back into those and say, all right, got these 3 vendors. They're delivering here. They're delivering Saturday. This one's going to be doing Monday, and this one's going to be on Wednesday. So you're going to have all of those pieces. Here's another key component of this: what does the build structure actually look like in terms of what do the work instructions look like on the floor? What piece of material do you need first? Right? This can help you. If you've got a 12-week lead time and you don't need every piece of it out on the floor first, how can we get that information to the supply chain and say, listen, don't need it all. I need these 3 pieces on day 1 because that's the first thing we put together. Does your supply chain person know that? And again, might not be able to do this for every product, but if it's that key, you know, bread and butter, keep your lights on product line that you're building, maybe they need to know that information so that they can continually be monitoring those 3 pieces and say, hey, anytime we got a new load of items, anytime we got a new lot of items going across the floor, I need to focus in on these 3 pieces. If I can reduce the timelines on those at all, that's going to help us get that work going on the floor. And as soon as I do reduce those timelines, or if they extend, if our vendor says, hey, you know what? I said 2 weeks, it's actually going to be 3. All right. You put the phone down with the vendor, you pick the phone up to the manufacturing floor management, and you say, hey, management, just got word it's going to be out another extra week on that. Can we put another product line out there on the floor so that the people aren't just sitting there twiddling their thumbs? It's just not going to be here. We'll get it to you as quick as we can. They said they had a delay at the factory X, Y, and Z, whatever. But this is the day it's supposed to be getting here now, right? Those type of communication channels, and then that is specifically in this example helpful to the manager on the floor who turns right around and says, all right, how are we going to restaff? How are we going to refocus? Again, might not be a pertinent example for every situation, because if you only have one product line, you build one product. But at least you will know how to kind of offsource or outsource different groups. And that can help with your training, right? So maybe you need to cross train some of the folks on the very front side of a build. If you have John and James and Jill out there, they're the only 3 people who can do the first stage. Maybe you cross train them and teach them how to do something on another product line or on the back end or something like that, so that they don't sit there twiddling their thumbs when that material doesn't come in. It can be helpful to know that kind of thing, and it can be helpful to send that information back out to the floor so that they can properly staff. And then, of course, the same thing with the workload balancing. How do we determine where the workload's going to go, what emphasis we're going to put on a certain product line based on that material availability, and those potential issues. Again, that quick communication is what's extremely important. Goes back to the last slide about creating those solid as a supply chain professional, creating that solid communication channel and understanding where those touch points are and when you need to exercise them. I see you pop on, Dave. Am I at 10 minutes?
Yep, we have about 10 minutes left.
Fantastic. Well, this is perfect timing because I was just getting ready to say, I believe that is about it. I would love to hear any questions that might have popped up. Any thoughts, any comments too, to say, yeah, I've seen this work, or no, I haven't seen that work, or it's, you know, things like that. I love to hear the commentary. I love to hear the questions. So I'm going to open up I'm going to stop yapping and open up the floor.
Doesn't look like we have anything in the chat. If anybody has any questions, feel free to drop them in there. In the meantime, Adam, I'll ask you a question.
Yes.
Most of my time in industry was with small manufacturers, 20, 30, 40 person shops, and in the metals industry. So we didn't carry a lot of weight with our suppliers. Um, so some of the stuff you're talking about, trying to develop relationships and work with them, how do you suggest starting that process when you don't have enough buying power to be as important to them as maybe a larger company is?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's a really great question. And I've seen that many times. Even for us. So as Dave mentioned, being Northrop Grumman, being a gigantic company, doesn't always mean we need a significant piece of your business as a supplier, right? So sometimes we would even find we only need 10 pieces of something, and this company that we're trying to buy off of, their usual smallest order is like 20,000. So we're just a little teeny tiny piece of their business, and they don't really care. So they're just whatever. We just if we lose it, we lose it. Kind of big deal. I would say one of the things that I've seen as far as the strategy, and this isn't always possible, but is at least a potential. So, kind of collaboration with other groups who might be especially out of your industry, but get the same product. So at a higher rate, almost as an addition, right? So they almost start to act as a distributor to you. So if company over here, I'm not in competition with them. They're not going to look at me as a or maybe you work for them. Maybe you're a vendor of theirs, and you say, "Hey, I see that you all have reams and reams and reams of this metal sitting in the back, or rolls and rolls of this metal sitting in the back. We often get it, but we don't have a really good relationship because we own such a small portion of it. Maybe what you do is you piggyback with them and you say, we would like to buy it at a premium from you as our distributor so that we can get a portion of that you're buying so that we can use it for another project or things like that. So looking for those opportunities, and your supply chain folks are your key people for this type of communication. They're the folks who are going to know what that other company builds because they're sourcing them out, right? They're trying to figure out all the things that any of your companies can do to help you out and to supply you with something. They can source that kind of information out. They can start thinking through, well, what is it who am I working with and what do they do? And would they potentially be a source for us to collaborate on an order together? And we spend, they're buying 20,000 pieces of X, Y, and Z. We need 100. Maybe they make their next PO 20,100. We siphon off that 100 and, make it worth their while, obviously. That's one thing. And then other is just, you know, there's lots of different techniques. I think general interpersonal communication, being able to tap that one person on the shoulder, even if you're a smaller group, um, and sometimes maybe explaining a little bit more about your situation with that vendor. And again, I do know that there are proprietary information, things like that can't come out during. Totally get it, totally understand. Contractual information can't come out and get it, totally understand. But if you're a supply chain person, can find a human at that company you're trying to source from and explain the issue. I have seen in the past, I won't guarantee that this can happen, but I've seen in the past, people are polite enough to say, listen, here's a distributor of our material. Let me help you out because I know that you're not going to be big on our radar, but you might be a decent one for them. So they can help you, give you another potential source of that material.
Yeah, that zero for operator doesn't seem to work these days. You just get into a feedback loop of the customer service menus, and it can be a struggle.
Totally.
We do have one more question in the chat.
Yes.
It says you mentioned supply chains that focus on American-made materials. Do you have any insight about benefits from sticking to U.S. suppliers?
Um, I mean, I think the biggest benefit to me, and this is something I've seen across the board, is the disruption issue, right? When you talk about global supply chain disruption, if it's not a primary focus of yours, it should be, right? Because the world is changing and it's crazy, as we all have seen in the past few years. It's just been nuts. So the disruption issue is probably the biggest one that I've heard come out of circles that I've been in discussions with, and that is just being able to have a readily available stock. Let's go back to what I was saying about finding those key pieces of subcomponents, right? If it is something that is going to be the end of your company if you don't have, and you're getting it from, you know, Zimbabwe, Australia, wherever, um, that would keep me up at night. And if it keeps you up at night, the best solution as a proactive measure would be at least to explore what the continental United States has to offer in that world. Even if it's 10 times more expensive, having that card to pull out of your back pocket, already having those communication channels open, just talking to them doesn't mean you're going to change your supplier, but finding out a little bit more information. Again, if you're contractually obligated, I know there are things like that happen, but whatever. If you're not contractually obligated to not source another supplier, let's say, and you have the ability to reach out and at least establish some communication channels, just probe a little bit, get that going. You have that back card to say, listen, it might be 10 times more expensive, but I'll do it for a while until that distribution issue resolves itself. Hopefully, if not, inside sourcing, right? What can you do to build it yourself? If it's totally out of the realm of possibility, there's your answer. But if it's not, what does that plan look like? Well, if we had to build this one key subcomponent, how much money? What would we need? What machines? What people? Time? All that kind of stuff. Just have it in a little break glass in case of emergency thing. That you break the glass, you pull it out, and you say, "Oh, this is our plan." It's a ready-made plan. I wouldn't spend a million years on building your plan, but if you got it, it's going to be better than if you don't got it when that happens. So I think that's probably the biggest advantage of U.S. based supply chain is the disruption issue. You'll still have a potential for disruption issue. I mean, look at what happened North Carolina, with the flooding, and you just really never know when your supplier may, even in the United States. But at that point, at least, I mean, again, if it's your key component, you might want to have a secondary source, at least in ideation and thought on what you would do if this happens to that one key component. But that's one of the things that I've heard mostly about why to stick in or why to go outside. But then there's also solutions to the if you go outside. So I don't want to like paint with a broad brush and say that there's no other options that you can do. There are supply channels that you could develop, even if you're getting material outside of the United States that don't go the preferred route. They might go the roundabout way to get to you. But if you have that design, say, okay, well, if this goes down, we can go that route and we can still get what we need. Having those type of scenario based issues at least thought through and have some sort of a plan for it. That's what you can do in terms of external and
Never
support.
hurts to have a plan B.
Yeah.
Oh, it doesn't look like we have any other questions in the chat, and we're coming up on 1 o'clock. So I'd like to thank everybody for joining us today. Tracy will be sending out some links with this presentation and some contact information. If you have any questions between now and next week or want to register, everything you need will be in those emails. And feel free to reach out to myself or Adam at any time. Thanks again for spending your lunch with us today, and we look forward to seeing you all next Thursday for the second part of this series.
Thank you all. Appreciate you.